cover for the DVD. Marjorie's Wake, forever after, where the river sprawling in fusion, we might shut off the motor and study the floating hyacinths. If that was the nexus to me of this entire project, because it described how Rollins herself learned to shuck the intellectualism that she brought here with her from the North. She was a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of University of Wisconsin. She came to Cross Creek in 1928 with her husband, Charles. Charles left her in the early 1930s, which is one of the reasons she took this river trip that she wrote about in Hyacinth Drift. But that was more than just her getting over a heartbreak. It was her making the transition from only trusting intellectual data and information in her head to beginning to pay attention to the clues in nature, because the hyacinths were the key to helping them find their way out of this puzzle lake. A place where the charts were doing them no good, a place where her traveling mate Desi finally said, "Young'un, we just need to sit here and watch the hyacinths drifting, because the place where they're drifting the fastest will show us where the deeper parts of the river are, and we'll follow the hyacinths." And that natural clue did lead them out of Puzzle Lake, and it led Rollins on to other transitions in her own life, where she got out of her head and more into her heart and her feelings about place. Honoring the enduring power of story, which we continue to do today, here's a great folk historian. We're losing our folk historians. We're losing the people who tell stories and put such great value in stories. We can write them down. As writers, as any of us who write, we can write these stories down, but the people who pass along the oral tradition seem to be passing along themselves. This is Bill Dreggers from the DeLand area. He's often on the river keeper trips, and he helps us understand some of the great nuances of how everybody viewed the animals over time. I asked Bill once when I was researching River of Lakes what a folk historian is, and he says, "A folk historian is the oldest living person who still has a memory." Sharing the ecological lessons is part of understanding the whole. God is in the details. We see a limpkin. We know here's an animal that's mainstay of its diet is the apple snail. Here's the apple snail eggs growing on some pickerel weed. And we come to understand that that snail needs reasonably clear water and good eelgrass to live. You see a limpkin, you know that the habitat is reasonably healthy for it. We are jeopardizing, and we have for a while, our connection to the river, not just in ways where we separate ourselves from it, but in ways that we allow things to happen in the floodplain that sooner or later find themselves down to the river itself. On the right is an example of how we actually sever the wetland connection from the river. And here, this is actually along Lake Monroe. You see that some game and fish biologists have planted some bulrush to replicate the wetlands that once were there along the shore until the bulkhead was put in and then backfilled. Structural changes to the watershed, a big challenge, and there's a bit of good news there in that all the very geometrically perfect angles that you see have been changed in certain places, namely in the upper St. Johns River, where a lot of the pasture lands have been reclaimed and turned back into wetlands again. That's probably the greatest success story of the entire St. Johns. A loss of our vernacular places and communities does continue to happen. This was the home I lived in for 15 years. It was an old cracker farmhouse built out of heart cypress, and right next to it are the hooded pitcher plants that are very rare, found only in certain places that are usually nutrient-poor bogs. Everything sort of fits together. The biological diversity will often spawn or relate to the cultural diversity of place. The values of sustaining our sense of place, what do we get from it? It's an intangible, right? We get the sense of wholeness. We get what's now being defined through a new term called eco-psychology. We get the opportunity to reconnect with a place that has really nurtured our spirit for thousands and thousands of years. E.O. Wilson writes about it. He calls it biophilia hypothesis, in which he talks about humans' innate affinity for nature. Ecopsychology, which has come to be since the 1980s, with a book by Theodore Roszak called The Voice of the Earth, helps us understand we can reconnect with these places, and therapeutically, clinically, we can restore the connections that we've lost, and we can become more whole again, the wholeness. That's it, guys.